Warning, the following podcast may cause you to question your belief in government, disregard authority, get arrested, be disowned, or deported. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, share our blog posts, and rate them on our website, curmudgeons.net. This is the Anarchy 101 edition of the podcast. Since we renamed the podcast, we thought it would be good to switch back and forth between news and current events and some more general libertarian anarchist topics. And what better way to start than with what is anarchy, or Anarchy 101. So I started with, maybe back up for a second, what kind of spurred this was Aaron got this book that he says that he made me buy called Libertarian Anarchy by Gerard Casey. And if you're not familiar with Casey, he's an associate professor at University College in Dublin, and he's also an adjunct scholar at the Mises Institute.
And also the curmudgeons.net man crush.
That's not a real thing. So I just finished
It will be soon.
It will be, yes. I just finished reading this book. Aaron, have you finished reading the book yet?
No, I haven't. I am interested enough to digest the opinions as I read it rather than just skimming through.
Well, it's not my style. So it's a great book. It's 200 pages, but it's really only 150 pages. The last 50 pages are notes and bibliography, which is incredible.
It's almost like he's a scholar and he wants to document the things that he
just
studied.
Making wild assertions. And maybe when we're done, we can run through the contents and do a brief survey. But let's start with anarchy as a definition. And I'm just going to read a couple of the so-called definitions from Merriam-Webster. The first is anarchy is an absence of government, or a state of lawlessness or political disorder due to the absence of governmental authority. Now, I think we could both get on board with that first one,
yes,
right? Absence of government,
yeah.
Which is pretty much the real definition. But I don't know how the second one made it in there.
What's funny is that they don't seem to mind that the definitions contradict each other.
The third definition here is a utopian society.
Right.
Now, I didn't do this, but if we had looked up conservatism or republicanism or liberalism or any of the other isms, I'm guessing the word utopian doesn't show up anywhere in those definitions.
I'm guessing you're correct. What's funny, though, is how do you define something as B, a state of lawlessness or political disorder, which sounds like a dystopia, and then turn around and say this, C, we can also consider a utopian society.
Well, it's utopian in quotation marks, right?
Well, it is highlighted here.
It's highlighted, yes. The second, I guess that was the first top-level definition. And the second definition they gave was absence or denial of any authority or established order.
Which is a beautiful definition to me.
That's perfect.
That's what we have now, even without having to have quote-unquote political anarchy.
Yeah, but the one right below it, again, contradicts, right?
Yes.
Absence of order. As if anarchy is...
As if people will not organize on their own, and they need their dad and mom to tell them what to do.
Yeah, I put a couple notes here. When you say anarchy, most people think of Mad Max or Sons of Anarchy,
yeah.
Or dystopian movies like Book of Eli. There was a movie last year.
The Road.
The Road.
Yeah, that would be a good one.
There was a movie last year called The Purge, and it looked interesting. I'd like to see it, but the concept was that once a year for 12 hours, any crime is legal.
Oh yes, yeah, I saw a trailer for that at one point. It does look interesting.
And it's been lumped into anarchy. The whole premise is the government allows people to go murder one another.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
For a certain period of time.
Yes. So somehow I don't understand how removing the law. That just goes back to the Merriam-Webster original definition here, your B definition, state of lawlessness.
Yes.
That's an imposed state of lawlessness for 12 hours. It's crack pottery to think that has anything to do with anarchy.
Good word. So,
I should patent that. We'll talk about that another time.
That's a different podcast. from Casey's introduction to his book, which, if I didn't say it, the title is Libertarian Anarchy Against the State. He defines anarchy as the position in which a society naturally finds itself when it is not subject to the power of a state. The theory that argues for the desirability of such a condition is anarchism.
Right, which makes sense because the natural state of man, even without finding itself somewhere, would be having no government.
He makes a distinction between two varieties, he says, of anarchism, philosophical and practical. And I think this is where the utopian thing comes in, right?
Yeah.
And the question that people always have, well, how could that ever work, or how would you ever get there, right? I would say we're both philosophical and practical anarchists, right? It's, and some people could assent, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but some people can assent to the idea of limited government, so to speak, or smaller government, or local authority, or whatever it is, but they can't make the jump to how it could ever work itself out in practice.
Yeah, every time I think about this, people start to talk about limiting government, and the question I always ask is, okay, well, where do you limit that to? And they always go back to the state should have more power. And then you say, well, what about this such and such act, how about in Pennsylvania, the transportation bill that passed, that now people living in the middle of nowhere have to pay for trains in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh. And you just break it down and further, and finally you come to that realization that it's the individual is the only locality that should have authority.
Yeah, I've used this example with people, and you can get, mostly on the right side of the political spectrum, the so-called conservative Republican, right? But you can start with the state, and then you can say, well, what if we could break that down further? Could we, what about our town? Oh, yeah. And they'll assent with you if you continue to make the ring smaller and smaller, right?
Yeah.
But once you get down and it's, you might even be able to get them to agree to, like, a community. But
right.
Once you get down...
I have things in common with these people. Sure, we can, They all think the way I do, so yeah, we should do that.
But once you get down to just me and my family and my household governing ourselves, they're like, no, that is crazy talk. That is no way that could possibly work.
Well, and the reverse of this is, I think, also a good argument. We think about how many layers of government we have, as we just were discussing. You get all the way to the top authority, right? We're living under that at every moment. We have all these laws and everything else. But you go out to the middle of nowhere, take a walk through the woods. What laws are you really under? How are you acting? You're acting the way you desire to act.
Right.
You don't have any laws over you because there's no one watching you.
I like what Casey also says at the end of his introduction, which is we always live in some condition of anarchy at some level or other, which is kind of what you were just saying. Mm-hmm. Whether it's between nations today, governments, or between the states, or between two different cities or towns within, there's always some level of where there is no higher authority above two individuals or two towns or two whatever it is. So the question isn't will we have anarchy, it's what level
exactly
will we have anarchy. And that's the part, like we said, that people have a real hard time making the jump to.
The other is the confusion, right? Because so often, like, most people would look up anarchy in Webster's and think the first definition is going to be chaos. Right. Those two words have become inextricably linked, and I think it's disturbing that such a condition has occurred. I think it's funny. I think I've posted this before, but Tolkien wrote a letter to his son, and he says, "My political opinions lean more and more toward anarchy, philosophically understood, meaning abolition of control," which much better definition right there than not whiskered men with bombs. And that's what most people think about.
Right. Well, and Casey's really good about defining terms in this book, right? What is anarchy? That's why he calls it libertarian anarchy. He wants to differentiate between the bomb throwing and the guys in their shack in Montana who are sending bombs to people and trying to just destroy society, as opposed to true anarchy, which is people who just want to be left alone.
Exactly.
So, like we said before, anarchy is the logical conclusion of libertarianism, and anarchy is guided by what is known as the non-aggression principle.
Or NAP if you're a nerd.
NAP, if you like acronyms. Which the non-aggression principle says that no one may initiate or threaten to initiate the use of coercive physical violence, aggression, against the person or property of another. Now, at first, that sounds like that's a no-brainer, right? And everybody would be like, of course you can't initiate violence against other people.
That's until you're Massachusetts and you want to enforce a ban on upskirt photos.
Right.
You need a law to do that.
And this is where people fall down on the logic of the thing, right?
Right.
Which is why Casey's book is so good. He's a philosopher and a logician, and he tears apart these ridiculous straw man arguments. So, if it's not okay for you or me to initiate violence against someone else, then it's not okay for you or me wearing a government uniform or with a government badge to do the same thing. There are not two moralities, right? There is only one morality, and it applies to everyone, regardless of who their employer is.
Yeah, the simple example of this is the TSA, right?
Right.
It's not okay for you to go up and fondle someone's genitals. Probably shouldn't be okay for them to do it just so that you can get onto an airplane.
Right. Yeah, it's not okay for me to stop you in the street, put a gun to your head, and tell you to give me all your money. So it's not okay for the government to threaten to do that if you don't give them your money.
Exactly.
Right?
Oh, but there's an objection right there. That's going to be one of the first objections.
This is probably where the first objection comes in. This is where a lot of the conversations I have about anarchy go.
Yeah. They're not going to kill you.
That's one, yes. Well, they wouldn't do that. I actually had someone tell me that. They're certainly not going to kill you. Like, well, what if I don't let them take me to jail? Well, then they're going to try to restrain you without hurting you. I'm like, well, I don't want to be restrained, and you follow that down. And I think it's Lou Rockwell says this: if you resist sufficiently paying a parking ticket, they will kill you, right?
Yeah.
Taking to its logical conclusion that they don't have the right, first of all, to charge me for anything, for a non-crime, a non-violent act. Then they certainly don't have the right to try to imprison me, kidnap me, and then if I resist that, they say they have the authority to kill me.
And I'm pretty sure that everyone would agree that you're guilty of murder when you kidnap to death.
Right.
So if they imprison me for the rest of my life because I continue to resist, they're killing me.
Yes. Oh, so the other major the other major objection that comes up at this point is the so-called social contract, right?
Yes.
The implicit.
I signed it when I was a baby.
Yes, right. Well, you live here, and these are our laws, so you are, implicitly agreeing to them, even though you've never signed a contract. You never.
Largely, this is the same thing as feudalism.
It is, right.
You were born into your role in society.
Yeah.
And you will play out that role because people say you should.
Yeah, and you can't take that argument back any further because there's no logic behind it at all. It just is, right?
Yeah.
And if you question people on that, you usually just get anger or
and that's
hate America. Why don't you leave?
That's the ridiculous nature of this. There is no basis at all for any sort of social contract. The only social contract we have is essentially the golden rule. If you want people to be nice to you, be nice to them. If you don't want people to murder you, don't murder them.
Right, which is
it's
sort of the non-aggression principle, right?
Right.
Not totally.
Yeah.
But it's the golden rule is actually more onerous, right? And that you're
to
do
good. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and the thing is, it doesn't require you to do good, though.
No.
It just says if you want to be treated in the same way. However, yes, you're absolutely correct. It's there's a tangential, not requirement, but prescription applied there.
So if you can get past the these first two objections, right, then there's some other probably less valid objections, or maybe less valid on the surface objections.
Yeah.
The one that always comes up that I love is who will build the roads? And I love how Tom Woods puts this. He says, So what you're telling me is without the state, you and I would just be sitting here on opposite ends of a field and we'd just be like yelling at each other like, hey man, I don't know how to get over there.
I'd like to bring you some of my grain to sell to you so your family doesn't starve, but it seems a long way.
I don't know how we could possibly get my wagon from here to there. Yeah, it's
disturbingly. We're making our entire society, even the adults, into children.
Right.
They have no ability to function on their own in any way, shape, or form. If this is what you admit, if you say, no, we couldn't do it on our own, that's what you're saying. You need a new mom and dad when you walk out of the house of your old mom and dad.
Right. Yeah, that you want to be perpetually a child, right? It also...
Well, and I understand the appeal of that, right? No responsibility, no consequences, really.
Yeah.
The only consequences are if you step out of line.
Well, it also deifies the state, right?
Certainly.
Because they are the all... If you just take the road example, they're the all-knowing, all-powerful. Like, who said they built the road in the correct place? Or they built the road correctly? Or...
How do we know they didn't steal someone's property to build the road there?
Well, and that's what people mean, right? When you get down to it, if you continue to ask these questions, what people really mean by roads, or who will build the sewage system, or who will do all these things, it's really who will initiate the violence against people to force them to sell their land so that we can build a road there, or force them to give up the right of way on their property so we can put a power line down there. It's these kind of things. That's what people have in mind, because they can't conceive that people could cooperate to build things like roads and sewage treatment systems and
you
power
couldn't
systems.
Talk to the old farmer that lives there and say, hey, we're going to build a road through here as long as you'll sell us your property. We only need X amount. How much do you want? And negotiate terms and then build the road. It seems like a lot of work.
And again, they always have an objection. But what about the holdout, right? As if these road companies, right, in our anarchist utopia, these road companies planned the entire path and didn't figure out that they weren't going to be able to build that last mile because of the old crotchety farmer wasn't going to sell his property.
Exactly. You know what? The roads might not be as straight.
They might not be as straight.
But does it matter?
Well, again, who says straight roads are the correct way to build roads?
Exactly. Right.
So that's one. Casey puts these objections in concentric circles. This one being the outermost, the easiest one to dismiss. Right? We can provide examples of private roads and private, water and sewage and power and all that stuff. So
half the states want to take their interstates and turn them into toll roads.
That's right.
And they want to have have outside agencies.
Have somebody in Denver. The E470 Expressway is my favorite road in the world. There's no one on it because these people hate to pay tolls. But you can drive 100 miles an hour, no toll booths to stop at.
No cops, probably.
No cops on the road. And it's owned and operated by a private company.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we have these examples. These are not valid objections. Maybe the next most centric circle would be health, education, and welfare. I don't think these are any more valid or any harder to dismiss. I think we actually have great examples in things like Obamacare and Medicare and Medicaid and all these government-run health plans. Social Security, the Department of Education, Common Core. I mean, we could go on and on and on. If anybody thinks those are there's nothing could be done better than that.
Yeah. Are these the optimal conditions under which we can live? I think you're right. There's no one who will say, yes, the public education system is the best it could be.
It's the best it could be, yeah. They will make that argument about health care, but it's a surface argument, and it's totally fallacious.
Strictly on an economic level, it wouldn't take much to defeat the notion that the healthcare industry is as efficient as it could be.
Right. The last objection, I lumped a couple together there, but the last and the one that Casey tackles in the book the most, because it's the hardest one to overcome, is who will provide justice, law, and order. And I like what he says in chapter 5. He says, our imaginations are limited by the tyranny of the present, we tend to believe unthinkingly that the way things are is the way things always have been and always have to be. And what he's saying is, you guys can't imagine that there could be a way to provide justice, law, and order without this criminal organization that we call the state.
I guess to a certain degree, some of the criticism that we could level back at that apparatus would be the same as the last objection we talked about. Certainly, do we think that the court system could be improved? All these things obviously can be improved. So if they can be improved, how do we know that something different won't work even better? Right.
Yeah, there's a couple points to be made on this, I think. One is, we know that laws don't prevent crime, despite what some people will say. That, there may be some base level of deterrence for some things. It's impossible to prove that, right? Mm-hmm. But we know for some things, it doesn't matter that there's a law. If laws prevented...
Even the punishment doesn't.
The punishment doesn't prevent anything. People who are going to commit premeditated murder think they're too smart to get caught, so they will probably do it.
Exactly.
Even whether there's a law or not, right? People who fly into a rage and kill someone or commit manslaughter weren't thinking about the fact that there was a law when they did it anyway.
Right.
So what is the difference? I think the argument that laws prevent crime has to be made for much lesser crimes. Ones that...
Right. Crimes that most people wouldn't do anyway. It's a crime of convenience more than...
and probably not ones involving violence.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yes, certainly, probably more people would try an illicit drug.
Right. Sure.
If there weren't laws at all about them. Do I think more people would
actually use them continuously? No. When we have examples of that from other countries,
exactly.
Right, where they're now, heroin is legal and marijuana is legal, and the usage rates don't go up.
No.
Right.
And in some cases, they even go
down. Yeah. Inconvenient for the war on drugs. So if you were to ask just somebody on the street what laws there should be, right? What things you shouldn't be allowed to do to other people?
Very simple. Don't steal, don't kill, right? And don't hurt.
Don't hurt other people, don't steal their stuff, and don't murder them, right? Those would probably be the ones that come to mind first, right? I think most people aren't going to come up with something like, well, you shouldn't cross a street at a non-intersection, right? Or else we will fine you and then put you in jail if you don't pay the fine, right? It's ridiculous. The basic laws that people think of and respect on a day-to-day basis, regardless of whether it's written on a piece of paper, are pretty much expressions of the non-aggression principle anyway.
Yeah.
So to say that we have to have this huge state apparatus in order to enforce these is strange at best. Right?
Yes. Yep.
We also have examples of private courts and private police throughout history, right?
Certainly.
And even today, in places where the state is falling apart and leaving, the one that I thought of was Detroit, where there are lots of private defense companies popping up.
Another example would be people who can afford it.
That's right.
Certainly celebrities and everyone else, they don't feel that they're
properly
protected, and they hire outside agencies to do this work as well. And I can't imagine that it's a small market. I haven't looked into any numbers. I don't know. I'm sure that information's out there somewhere, but I'm sure a ridiculous amount of money is spent on private protection.
Yeah. And none of this is to say that we think in the anarchist utopia there would be no crime, right?
No,
there
will always certainly would be.
There will always be crime.
Well, and another interesting thing about the way things run today is that we tend to want to enforce things before they happen.
Yes.
As opposed
to a lot of pre-crime.
As a consequence of actions that are actual crimes.
Right.
It's not a crime to drive after having drinking. Wow.
How many drinkings have you had?
A lot. It's not a crime to drive having had a few drinks. Rather, it's a crime to run over people in the middle of the street. You're doing violence to them with your automobile at that point.
Yeah, I guess I would say to people who object to this, ask yourself, what kind of things, and we're talking about more than just violence now, but what kinds of things do you, on a daily basis, have to order other people to do, right? other than an employer-employee relationship or some other voluntary relationship, like a member of a church and their leadership, or employer-employee, things that you've entered into voluntarily. You don't walk around on the street demanding that other people do things for you, right?
Right.
So why would you think it's okay to get somebody else to do that for you, right?
Right.
And you don't have a need to, for the most part, right? It's that next, I guess, logical leap that people have a hard time making.
Right. Well, and the idea that they won't be required to be active in any of this stuff. If there are already laws in existence to make people stop doing things that they don't want them to do around them, they don't have to do anything about it.
But that don't. It's like it's seems to be hypocritical, right?
Oh,
Because
it
it's
is.
only all those other people that need to be restrained by these laws. I'm not going to murder anybody, but you might, right?
Right. Well, the problem is, other laws are more convenient to us, right? Ordinances for loudness at night. Things like this that enforce essentially the social contract, right?
Yeah.
What we don't refer to as a social contract, but what people do refer to as a social contract. It's disturbing how convenience will take over our desire to treat other people as individuals and as free
and interact with them on a
yes,
right.
Right.
Yeah,
Certainly, I think we all have a circumstance at work or in our social lives where we have had to come up with an inventive way to convince somebody or to persuade them non-violently to alter their behavior. Whether it's just through a verbal conversation, whether it's through expressing to them by our actions how we feel about their actions.
Yep.
We've all figured out how to do that.
Yeah,
we don't need the government to do it.
I saw a couple of good videos the other day about dealing with bad neighbors.
Yes, I
Did you watch
probably
those?
saw the same.
One of them was a guy that his neighbors played loud, obnoxious music all night long, or all day long. So he hooked up a system that would play music right back through the wall as soon as theirs came on in.
Equally terrible music.
Equally terrible, and he would just leave it on while he was at work, and so that's one way. Probably not the way I would go about it, but
Right.
that's one way. The other one I saw was actually, I think, much better, and it was a guy whose neighbor's dog barked all the time.
Yes.
And he went to the guy and said, first, I'm going to give you some money just if you listen to my proposal here. And then he said, if you move your dog or keep your dog quiet, when you move out of this neighborhood, or it was a trailer park, I'm going to give you some more money.
Yep.
And he said, I never had a problem with that dog barking again.
Right.
The guy did what he needed to do. He either kept it inside or muzzled it or whatever it was. So, non-violently, they've resolved this problem.
Exactly.
Everybody was happy, and they didn't need to call the cops on each other or,
Yep.
use the force of the state. One of the last things I'd say here is, although neither of us are utilitarians, right? I think there's a good argument to be made by the so-called, if you were to weigh the so-called good the state has done in general over its period. And Casey limits himself to about the 17th century is what he calls the modern state, because it didn't exist like it does today before then, right? No. It was much more like what you've described before about smaller city-states and a lot more local,
yes.
right? Not this hegemonic
yes.
hegemonic overarching, just like controlling every aspect. But if you were to take all of the supposed good that the state has done over that time period and weigh it against all of the
evils that
they've done, including the number of people that the states have murdered, and you were to compare that number even to the number of private homicides, it's an order of magnitude or multiple orders of magnitude, right?
Certainly.
So if we were utilitarians, it would be an argument against having a state right there, right?
Right.
The state kills infinitely more people than it supposedly helps. And then it's able to save by its own laws and its own law enforcement.
We have not yet discussed the "it'll never work" objection, which I would lump in with the people who advocate for the social contract.
Yeah.
You're just, again, you have no evidence, you have no reasoning behind why you object to it. You merely aren't going to agree.
It's Casey's imaginations are limited by the tyranny of the present, right?
Yeah.
You can't possibly imagine anything else. And maybe finally is the, and I had this actual conversation just a couple weeks ago with somebody who was that same kind of person where they can get the philosophical anarchism, they can't get the practical, and they just say, well, how could we ever get from here to there, right? And to that I would say it's what we're doing, right? It's writing and blogging and podcasting and educating people, having conversations with people, and espousing the idea of nonviolence, non-aggression. And in the end, we don't need people to do stuff, right? We need people to stop doing things. We need the state to stop doing the evil things they do. We need people to stop working for the state and enforcing their laws and obeying their laws even, right?
It's interesting that we have more objection to that from general society than there was to the rebellion against the British Crown that happened at the American Revolution.
Right.
And that was for a violent means to altering government.
Yeah, you're crazy if you just want people to stop supporting the government, right?
Right, yeah.
You know, yes, I will still pay taxes because I don't want to be murdered, right?
Right.
And I will still go along with your stupid laws to the extent that it's feasible, right?
Yeah.
But I'm going to continue to talk to you and try to convince you that this is wrong. But that's crazy compared to, I'm going to go get my rifle and we're going to go...
Come join me, let's go shoot a bunch of people, and then we'll change things the way we want them to be changed.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the French Revolution is always held up as, oh, how awful, blood in the streets and, you know, all this this violence. But
you mean the French Revolution that was the outgrowth of the American Revolution? That one?
Exactly, yeah. That's probably a little too specific for what we're talking about because we're not talking about the American state here. We're talking about all states.
All states in general.
Everywhere,
yes.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it is a legitimate thing to think about, the fact that there is this resistance, this cultured resistance, or this culturally enforced resistance to the idea of change, even nonviolent change, where violent change is almost more, it's preferred. It's sad.
It's preferred.
We wanted to end with a final quote from Gerard Casey. He says in the introduction to his chapter on anarchy and anarchism, "At the heart of the idea of anarchy is a deep-rooted resistance to having your life and actions ordered by others to whom you have not voluntarily subordinated yourself."